Hey guys, it's me, Wolf, back with another video. This time it's not part of the Stronghold Crusader build series and it's more on the educational side, but the idea came from one particular moment in the latest windmill video. Normally you could also use a chisel for this job, but all the chisels I own are old and dull, and I guess you already read the title, but I'm going to show you how I've attempted to restore my chisels and build a little device that helps me sharpen them correctly. So I have to mention something beforehand real quick. This was my first time doing this. I did a little bit of research and tried to learn from my own mistakes, so I'm not an expert, but I still want to take you along my sharpening journey, explain my thought process, and maybe you can learn at least one useful thing in this video. Let's first take a look at the current state of the chisels. And I gotta warn you, if you have heart problems you might want to skip this part, because they are not looking all that good. Okay, it's not that terrible, and I have to defend myself a little bit here by telling you a short story. These chisels were handed down to me by my grandpa, and for the longest time I didn't know how to properly use and take care of them. Now, to be fair, my grandpa was a hobby woodworker himself, and he probably didn't know how to take care of them either, and judging from all his other tools, he often went for the cheaper, low quality option, something that I also like to do sometimes. But don't get me wrong, my grandpa had to feed his family, otherwise I wouldn't be here right now, and he had little to no excess money to spend for himself, so he had to make do with what he had. And he was the one who let me use his workshop and all his tools and taught me lots of things. So it's fair to say that without him I wouldn't be doing this right now. But that was the history of the chisel, and now I'm attempting to prepare them for a brighter future, hopefully. Let's begin with taking the blade out of the handle. Not because the handles were already loose, but because I thought it would be better like that to not further damage the handle when sharpening the blade and vice versa. So let's begin with the blade. I started with removing most of the rust with a bit of fine steel wool and some WD-40. Another method would be to clean the metal part with vinegar or even put it in vinegar overnight. Rust remover would work as well, as long as you don't leave it on for too long or it might damage the metal. And if you're a hobby chemist, you could also use electrolysis. I'm definitely going to try that in a future video, because I'm really interested in how well that's working, but back to the chisels. During this initial rough work I decided to wear some gloves, and I laid down my scrap wood that I use for staining so that my table doesn't get too dirty. After a short amount of time the chisels looked like this, and honestly, if I were to put a good cutting edge on there, this look would already be fine for a rustic chisel. But something really important that the chisels are still missing is being completely flat on the underside. I have these water whetstones, but last time I used them I got them really dirty and rusty, so I thought it would be smart to start off with sandpaper to get the dirtiest part done. For that I needed a smooth surface, and the only thing I have is this glass plate from an old scanner, but this should work. And with a bit of duct tape to hold the sandpaper in place and a clamp to hold everything in place, I started going on my sanding journey. Shortly after, the chisels looked like this. I was surprised at the quick progress and thought, wow, these chisels are actually pretty easy and fast to restore. But oh boy was I wrong. You know, I was just getting my knowledge on how to sharpen a chisel from watching a couple YouTube videos, and I've had some expectations on how this was supposed to play out. Start with flattening the underside, go up in sandpaper grits, then do the cutting edge, go through the higher grits. Easy peasy, right? Some creator said something on the line of, I think sharpening a chisel is relaxing, it's almost therapeutic to me. And then I saw the Japanese grandpa in his garden sharpening a hand planer blade on a natural stone, really relaxing and aesthetic. You know what's also really relaxing? If I take this chisel and shove it up my Now I knew that a chisel is made out of hardened steel and that it was gonna take a long time, but I completely underestimated how long it would actually take. In hindsight I know what I should have done instead, but at that moment I sadly didn't. After 3 strips of 400 grit sandpaper, I switched over to 240 grit sandpaper because I was getting nowhere. This was the result after 2 hours of only sharpening this chisel on 240 grit sandpaper. It is looking a lot cleaner, but it is still far from being flat. Small side note here, I wanted to leave this part like it was because I thought it would look cool to leave this part leading up to the blade old and rusty like this, and then have a shiny blade in the front. But anyways, after another hour I got the other chisels to that state, but this can't be it. I used up a bunch of sandpaper and then I decided to hop over to the waterstone because I was tired of changing the sandpaper all the time. I put my 2 whetstones inside a container and filled it up with very clean water. I let them in there for about half an hour and they should be ready to use when they are no longer bubbling. I gotta admit, these are pretty cheap, low quality whetstones that I got from Amazon, but when I bought them they still came with a base to hold them in place. But after using them for the first time, I left the still wet sharpening stones in a cardboard box and everything got moldy and the base was already falling apart. So one lesson I've learned the hard way is to let them air dry overnight before putting them into storage. Also, the stones might break if you leave them submerged in water all the time, so one important rule is use wet and store dry. To hold the whetstones in place, I slapped together this frame with the first pieces of wood I could find and clamped it onto the table. And now the endless sharpening story continues on the coarsest stone I have, which is a 400 grit stone. After another hour of flattening my largest chisel, it got more shiny in the middle, but it doesn't get shiny everywhere. That means that either the chisel or the waterstone isn't flat. Once again, in hindsight, I know that trying to get the rough part of sharpening or flattening done on a 400 grit stone was the wrong approach in the first place, and I could have saved this time and effort I put into using it. After that hour of sharpening, I got kinda discouraged and tried to flatten the bag with the help of a machine. This electrical water whetstone was also my grandpa's, and it is, just like the chisels, not in the good condition. The middle of the stone is worn out and it wobbles when it turns, but I still attempted to flatten the backside on this whetstone. The result was relatively flat, but very scratchy. I gotta be honest, after that I got even more discouraged, so I went to the store and bought some low quality diamond sharpening stones. Well, sharpening discs? Blades? I don't know what to call them, but they cost me $15 and come with 180, 300 and 400 grit. One little problem I had with these is how to fixate them. They aren't thick enough to put into my contraption and I have to keep them in place somehow, so I came up with a rather creative idea. I don't praise myself very often, but putting Velcro on these sharpening plates actually works really well. I tried it out with a chisel to see if it holds, and once you're done with one grit, just switch to the next grit. As I said, not the best quality on these bad boys. But with the 180 grit plate, I was finally making some progress in flattening the bag. Did it take me 2 hours again? And did I switch to the higher grit and later to the waterstone too fast again? Yeah, I did. And the outcome was accordingly bad, so I did every step again. Started with the electric whetstone, then got over to the 180 diamond sharpener, then the 300 diamond, and after the 400 grit diamond sharpening plates, the chisels looked like this. There are still some bigger visible scratches and imperfections on the underside, but overall speaking it should be pretty flat now. Small side note, I have this electrical tape around my fingers because I got a little too close to the sharpening blade sometimes and cut myself a little. Professional. Small side note number 2, cleaning these sharpening plates with an old toothbrush works really well. If we are looking at the largest chisel right now, you can see that I have flattened the whole underside with 400 grit diamond stone and already continued to flatten it on the 400 grit waterstone. This was also the time when I finally realized that my waterstone is not flat at all, and maybe the chisel is a little bent too, but I still used the 180 grit diamond plate to make it flat. I didn't really do it long enough to get it all flat, but I'm going to only sharpen the front of the blade, so I used one side of the stone and then flipped it over to at least try to wear it off equally. To really see the difference the water stone makes, I also wanted to show you the progress on the medium chisel. Do you see how it slowly gets clearer in the middle? Then the clear part gets a little wider and so on, and that's how I did it with all the other chisels as well. Now that the underside of the blade is cleaned up with a 400 grit whetstone, I started to sharpen the cutting edge. What I could do now is to learn the skill to hold the angle by hand, but to be completely honest, I didn't have the patience to do that, so for now I'm going to use a sharpening jig. There are different sharpening or honing jigs on the market already. I could have gotten a cheap one from Temu for as low as $5.84 here, and here's the same one for a different price, and here again, I have never ordered anything on Temu, so I don't know how this works. Let's jump over to Amazon. There are a variety of sharpening jigs here as well, a little pricier, and the overall pick, for example, this Sharp Pebble one costs $45.99 and it looks pretty well made quality wise. An even more expensive one that I've seen in videos would be the Lee Nielsen Honing Guide. That one is $150, but it comes with a variety of jaws for different angles and blade types, and the quality on this one is probably very high. But if you know me a little, you already know what I was thinking. Why buy something that works when I can have a hard time making it myself and not being sure if it's ever going to work? No, honestly, thank you brain for doing this to me. Thank you, I am glad. So I hopped on SketchUp to draw, let's call it a slightly phallic looking frame where all the parts can be mounted onto. Maybe you weren't thinking that about the shape, but I can't unsee it now, so you're welcome. By the way, when I 3D print stuff, I'm always letting the printer make a brim around the piece. That really helps with blade adhesion. But the downside of this is once the part is printed out, I also have to cut off the brim with an X-Acto blade. And a little side note here as well. I've been calling this an X-Acto blade because it makes exact cuts. I thought that's just what you call this type of knife, and that's what I've heard other people call it as well. But I think in actuality it is X-Acto blade by the company X-Acto that makes hobby knives. So to be completely correct, this is a simple hobby knife, not by the company X-Acto, but I'm probably still going to call it X-Acto blade. After cutting off the brim, I lightly sanded the edges with a piece of 1000 grit sandpaper and hammered in the ball bearings. To hold them inside, I printed out a cover that I screwed onto the first piece. I marked and drilled the hole instead of just drawing a hole and letting the printer make it, because at a radius below 1 mm my printer doesn't work correctly. Maybe it's the fault of the printer, but more likely it's my fault for not setting it up correctly. But anyways, the cover does not go all the way down because I wanted the lower half that touches the side of the whetstone to be made out of brass. And while I'm doing my thing in the background, I'm explaining why exactly I picked brass. I got this knowledge from a job I was working on previously, and I'm not a technical drawer or machinist or I don't know, a chemist, so I don't know a whole lot about metal properties, but every time I was working with a moving part that involves friction or abrasion, brass took some kind of part in it. Something I had initially planned for this video was to go really into detail on material hardness, but it got a little out of hand and I got too deep into the Wikipedia click the next link fever. So I'm going to give you the shortened version of what I found out about material hardness scales. If you are not interested in that, feel free to skip to the next chapter. So close, there were different ways to measure materials in history. Some of them are still used today. One of the earliest hardness tests is the Mohs test. This method dates back to 300 BC and it works by, simply said, rubbing two metals together and see which one of them has a scratch. The numbers on the Mohs scale range from 0 to 10, 0 being the softest material and 10 being the hardest. Like in later hardness scales, these numbers are dimensionless, which means they don't have a unit like kilogram, pounds or Celsius or I don't know, and can only be seen in relation to each other. So for example, zinc has a Mohs hardness number of 2.5 and steel can range from 4 to 4.5. That simply means zinc is softer compared to steel. By the way, the hardest material with the number 10 on this scale is my P. The 10 is a diamond. The next viable, more exact method is the Brinell scale. The material is measured by making an indentation with a small steel ball or a tungsten carbide bit for harder materials and measuring the area of indentation. A bigger indentation means a softer material. So a typical Brinell hardness number, for example, would be a type of hardened tool steel which has 600 to 900 HB. And in parentheses HBW 103010, which stands for hardness Brinell. The W stands for Wolfram, which is the word for tungsten in most European languages, and that means that a tungsten carbide indenter was used. The first number stands for the diameter of the indenter in millimeters. The next one is the force in kilogram with which the indenter is pressing down on the workpiece, and the last number is for how long the indenter is pressing down in seconds. And as I said, there are different testing procedures with different scales recommended for different materials, so it's important to use the same testing method when comparing different materials. Another method that uses a similar testing procedure is the Janka hardness method that is used for wood hardness. The difference is that it measures the force it takes to press the steel ball into the piece of wood and not the indentation diameter. And this scale is still being used today. Now, because the Brinell scale from before is slow, not suitable for harder metal, and leaves a big indentation in the material, the Rockwell hardness test was invented shortly after. It's pretty similar function-wise. It uses an indenter that presses down with a preliminary force for some time and measures the depth it goes. Then presses down with a bigger force for some time and releases, then presses down with the first force again, and some time after it measures the depth again. And at the end, the difference between the two measured depth values determines the hardness. Pros of this test is that most of the indentation methods use a smaller spheroconical diamond indenter, to be precise, with a diameter of about 1.5 millimeters, and therefore does not leave a big indentation in the test piece. That means it's very suitable for frequent quality control. And obviously with different indentation methods, there have to be different scales again. For example, scale A can be used for cemented carbide thin steel, shallow case hardened steel, and I don't know, C for steel, hard cast irons, and you get the point. Different scales with different indenter types, forces and total forces and applications, so yeah, many scales again. Now, we could already use this hardness scale, but we have another hardness test that was developed 10 years later, the Vickers hardness test. The function is once again similar to the Brinell test or Rockwell test. The indenter presses down once with an upside down pyramid shaped diamond indenter, and then the ratio from indentation area to force is measured. So I guess you could say it's the combination of Brinell and Janka scale. Typical Vickers test number is 180 HV 3020. 180 is the hardness number, HV stands for hardness Vickers, 30 is the force in kilogram, and 20 is the indentation time. So after learning about all these hardness tests and scales, which one is the best? I would say the Morse and Brinell test are simply outdated, but choosing between the Vickers and Rockwell test is harder. What I got from my research is that both are viable. The Rockwell test works best for softer materials, and the principle is generally speaking simpler and quicker. You can also choose the perfect test scale for your product, but that means you also need many different scales. The Vickers hardness test works for most materials, soft and hard, but works better for harder materials, and it works for thin test pieces as well. It has no crazy amount of scales and is very precise, but it's slower and more expensive to do. In my case that doesn't matter because I'm just looking up the table online. So the Vickers test generally sounds better, but one application that I can think of where the Rockwell test is more suitable than the Vickers test is with materials that are coarser or unhomogeneous, if that makes sense. Because on the Rockwell test an indenter with a large diameter can be chosen, and with that a bigger area of material can be tested, whereas the Vickers tests only tests a small area of the product. fact is that when you research material hardness, you're probably gonna see both the Vickers and Rockwell scales interchangeably, and there are also tables to convert the two values. If you go to the Wikipedia site of a metal, copper for example, it shows us the Morse, Vickers and Brinell hardness. But let's go back to my project and back to brass. I simply chose the Vickers hardness test to compare brass to other materials, and I went to this website called MatWeb Material Property Data that looks like it has been there since the beginning of the internet, but that doesn't matter. Here we can see that the Vickers hardness of zinc is 30, for copper cold worked it's 100, and for brass it ranges from 80 to 140. Now in my application the brass rubs against the sharpening stone, so what hardness has the sharpening stone? I don't know, but I guess it's pretty hard. So why did I tell you all this? I don't know, but long story short, I'm using brass because it's hard enough to not instantly wear down when rubbing against the waterstone, and in contrast to steel, it's soft enough to not damage the waterstone. So here it is on there, and now I needed two brass rods that act as the wheels. I've seen online that most sharpening jigs only have one wheel, and I thought, why not make two to have 2 points of contact so I don't have to balance it on the wheel. Thinking back now, that isn't the case because the one wheel and the chisel itself create 2 points to balance everything as well, but that's how I did it. To fit the 10mm brass rod into the 8mm inside ring of the bearing, I had to take some material off, and because I don't have a lathe, I had to get a little creative. I spun the rod inside my drill press and held a file against it. You shouldn't really do that because it's not intended for the chuck to be exposed to horizontal forces, only vertical ones, but that was the only method I could think of that was reasonably quick. To fixate the brass rod to the bearing, I drilled a hole into the middle, and to help me find the exact midpoint, I 3D printed this little part to pre-drill and later drill it open. The scariest part here was to cut the threads, especially because I didn't have enough of the brass rod left to make another wheel, but it worked out. And at this point I'm just showing you the finished part because in hindsight I've made some questionable decisions and had to change some parts along the way. So to set the angle of the chisel I used a threaded rod with a stop nut on one end, and because I didn't have a wing nut I 3D printed this part that lets me fasten the rod. Now this simple part itself was a little challenging because my 3D printing software is outdated and I probably didn't set it up correctly either, but I had to make this part out of 3 parts to prevent overhangs. I remember that I was able to make overhangs in the fixing my bandsaw video, so I'm not entirely sure what happened here, but once again that's just how I did it. I put an aluminum pipe over the rod because my plan was to slide the chuck that is holding the chisel in place from left to right to use the sharpening stone evenly. Another thing I did that doesn't make a whole lot of sense is to use these washers on each side of the pipe. My thought process was, I want washers so that the pipe doesn't scrape off the plastic on the sides. And then I thought that the washers should be the same material thickness as the brass part right here to keep this side flat. And in addition to that imaginary problem, I didn't have any brass washers, so I had to make some myself. I used a scrap piece of brass, drilled a hole into it, then clamped it between 2 nuts and gave it the file drill press treatment again. In hindsight I know that it wouldn't have mattered because I could have just cut the pipe into a different length when using thinner washers. This copper rod here that I flattened on one side was meant to create a second contact point for the chisel, but that makes no sense at all, so I had to remove this one later. But the jaws and sliding part here were the parts that had to undergo the most changes. Here is a small compilation of our fallen brothers. To prevent the jaw from jamming, I had to make a closing mechanism independent from the sliding mechanism. The jaws have this shape on the bottom and can be moved inside this sliding part. Like this I was able to use one screw to clamp the chisel in place. The sides are still tilted, but that doesn't matter as long as the bottom of the chisel lays flat on the sliding part. I later had to make the sliding part longer because the biggest chisel didn't fit inside, and I still use this part for the smaller and medium sized chisel, but I later printed out a small piece that I glued and screwed on there. I also printed out this version of the jaws with this angle that I thought would improve the grip on the chisels, because the chisel also have this bevel on the side. But I don't want to talk about it. Also, they were too big for the smaller chisels, so... Another problem I had was that the lowest angle I was able to achieve with this jig is about 30 degrees, and that's already pretty steep for a chisel angle. Most of the chisel I've seen in my research were in between 20 and 35 degrees. But with this part I was finally able to sharpen, going through the grits. Diamond stone, water stone, please show me your sharpened chisel. At that point I also started to do the 3000 and 8000 grit stones by hand to practice hand sharpening a little bit, and after all that the chisels looked like this. To be completely honest, when I'm looking at the footage right now, I'm kind of mad at myself a little bit for not trying to polish out the deeper grooves and making the cutting edge shiny. But at that moment, after 5 days of trying to sharpen the chisels, I was just tired of it, and I had to settle on the chisels not being perfect. I still wanted to polish them though, and I bought these 2 pieces of green buffing compound. This one piece of buffing compound, I guess, and I rubbed them over a leather strap a couple of times. And after the buffing I still used some rust protection wax to lightly coat the chisels in, and that's it for the blade. Like that I can't use them properly, so I still need to restore the handles. I'm trying to get through that a little quicker because there's nothing too interesting happening here. At first I wanted to make a new handle for the medium chisel with the split handle and restore the other 2. But then I thought that it would look weird if only one chisel had a different handle, so I decided to make all 3 of them. I started off on the wood lathe where I roughly shaped a round piece of cherry wood. To measure the diameter for the steel hoop on the back and the ferrule in the front, I used this caliper, and after sanding and cutting off the excess pieces, I was ready to drill the hole for the tank. I drilled it step by step, starting with a pilot hole and then going up in drill diameter while also reducing the depth. Like this I was able to create a hole with a similar shape to the tapered tank. But before putting the blade into the handle, I still had to make the steel hoop and ferrule. I simply used a metal pipe with a diameter of 20 mm inside the saw guide to get a straight cut. And after a little filing and sanding, I hammered the metal rings onto the handle, cut off the excess pieces, and now I'm finally able to hammer the handle into the tank. On attempt number 2, I made sure to make the holes big enough, and I used a mix of beeswax and linseed oil to lubricate the tank. The handle is already looking good, but I used some natural wax finish that looks like and I gotta say, this cherry wood does look really nice. Sadly I didn't have more of this cherry wood, so I used some maple wood instead, but here they are all finished. I gave the biggest chisel the biggest handle, and even though these 2 are looking pretty good, I gotta admit the medium chisel is stealing the show. So did I do a good job sharpening them? I don't know, so let's give them the sharpness test. While cutting a piece of paper in the background, I gotta do a real talk real quick, and I was not sure whether or not I should post this video, because it gets quite technical sometimes and most of the video is just me failing. I mentioned it in the previous windmill video that I'm trying to exercise patience, but to be honest, this sharpening process was a bit too much for me to handle. So some important tips that I want to give you if you're attempting to sharpen a chisel or really any metal object yourself are: please buy quality sharpening stones. They can be expensive, but save time and frustration. I am definitely going to buy a better coarse diamond stone to get the roughest part done, and a finer one for finishing and toning from time to time. Take your time on the coarser grits, because if you do a bad job flattening the edge on the first grits, you're going to have a really bad time getting rid of the scratches. If you have an automatic grinding tool, use it initially to get the roughest part done. I could have made the sharpening process so much quicker if I had used the electric waterstone. When using automatic tools, keep in mind that the chisel needs to stay cool while grinding or it's going to lose some of its hardness. Invest in a proper honing guide or learn sharpening by hand with an older chisel. I have this disease sometimes where I see a product and think, I can make that myself and save a couple of bucks. Did I save money with this way of thinking? Yes, but until now I haven't built something that worked exactly how I intended it to, and most of the projects I built made me lose my mind. But I'm not giving up, and I'm sure that someday I'll make something that meets my expectations. But anyways, if you've come that far, thanks for watching this video. Next comes a Stronghold Crusader builds video again, and peace!